Associate Dean of Student Affairs in the Office of Student Diversity and Inclusion. I'd like to welcome you to our fifth installment of the Anti-Racism series. As you know, over the last 4 or 5 months, we've been holding our anti-racism series with eclectic and wonderful speakers each month. This presentation is nothing less than excellent. It will be intriguing, and I assure you that you will learn many things that you had not given any thought to. We've invited a local speaker who is promising to enlighten us in a great way today. Our speaker is Dr. Michael J. Sorrell. His topic today is Inconvenient Truths About an Uncomfortable Topic. He is the longest serving president in the 148-year history of Paul Quinn College, right here in our backyard in Dallas. During his near 14 years of leadership, Paul Quinn has become a national movement for its efforts to remake higher education in order to serve the needs of under-resourced students and communities. Included in Paul Quinn's numerous accomplishments during President Sorrell's tenure are winning the HBCU of the Year and the HBCU Business Program of the Year awards, creating the new urban college model, transforming the football field into the We Over Me farm, which I've taken the students to, achieving full accreditation from the Transnational Association of Christian Colleges and Schools, that is TRACS, and creating the college's first faculty-led study abroad program and rewriting all institutional fundraising records. Now, his resume goes on for about 2 pages. And I could spend the next hour talking about all of the wonderful accolades that he brings with him, but I will shorten that to say that he has a JD and a master's in public policy from Duke University and his master's, a doctorate of education from the University of Pennsylvania, where his dissertation defense was awarded with distinction. And while in law school, he was one of the founding members of the Journal of Gender Law and Policy and served as vice president for the Duke Bar Association. Dr. Sorrell is one of Dallas's finest. He has been a stalwart and a real warrior for really fighting for education for underprivileged students. And we welcome him today to give his presentation. Dr. Sorrell.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Nesbitt. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. I would be remiss if I didn't start out my remarks by just thanking UT Southwestern. What a lot of people don't know is the relationship that Paul Quinn has with the medical school and the medical center there. We are the beneficiaries of just a wonderful relationship with Dr. Ginsburg and with Chuck Ginsburg, and the work that you all have done with our mental health program, and helping make sure that we can provide the type of resources to our students that are necessary has just been tremendous. So we just want to say thank you. And so as I begin my remarks, I want to preface it by saying anyone who doesn't understand why it's necessary to talk about these things or think that you can just forget about them or let them go, there's an individual who has, intruded his way into our chats with, really vile and offensive language. And we haven't even started. We're having a wonderful, reasonable conversation about race. But there are individuals out there who are so threatened by these conversations, so threatened by the idea that others might have something to offer and that something to offer may reduce their own visions or versions or understanding of themselves, that they want to try to quiet those voices. And that's part of what I want to talk about today. And this notion of, inconvenient truths about uncomfortable topics Look, the reality of the life we live is that we live in a diverse world. We live in a world where people are different. And the idea of differences, the idea of otherness, poses a threat to insecure individuals who base all of themselves on this false perception of who they are and where they are. And unfortunately, as a country, we struggle with these ideas, and we struggle with this notion of what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be a participant in a democratic society? Now, lots of people typically believe in the idea of democracy as long as democracy looks like them, as long as democracy feels good and safe to them. The moment that you begin to add other individuals to the conversation, other viewpoints, other religions, other races, in many cases, other genders, well, then all of a sudden, democracy no longer is as appealing. And so now we are living in a time where we have to confront the idea that those who were minorities are no longer minorities, and those that were the majority are no longer the majority. And it has scared the bejesus out of many people. And so, for the short time that we have together today, I want to talk about why this idea is so scary, why people struggle with this notion of making room for others, and just why all of this is so important to get right. And so, let's talk a little bit about some inconvenient truths. Now, as a way of background, I come to this topic not just by my birthright, right? I don't claim to have insights simply because I am a Black male in America. Even though being a Black male in America certainly gives me lots of context and lots of examples. But what many people don't know is I worked in the Clinton White House for President Clinton with his initiative on race. And I was one of the special assistants to the executive director. And we spent a little over a year and a half, traveling around the country, putting together this understanding of what it means to discuss race in America. And we wrote a book about our findings. And it was really this incredible experience for me as someone who I minored in Black studies at Oberlin. I always understood that race played a part in my life. It played a part in how people viewed me. But it, as much as I am proud of being a Black male, I never allowed it to become my own prison, right? Like I understood how people may look at me, but I understood how I looked at myself. And that was, through this lens of someone who was proud of their accomplishments, proud of where I came from, proud that I am a descendant of enslaved peoples, not proud that they were enslaved, but proud of the experience that, proud of the fact that I am the product of people who made it through, who pushed past all the disadvantages and um, all of the heartache and trials and tribulations that they experienced, and yet they kept going. So I think that that experience is unique, and I think that it makes us stronger. So when I think about that, when I think about what it was like to be the child of parents who grew up in Jim Crow South. My dad was from New Orleans, my mother is from rural Louisiana. And I listened to their stories of midnight marauders. I listened to my grandparents' stories of what it was like to manage as a Black family in waterproof Louisiana and to keep each other safe and how to manage a life that felt full while still being limited. I listened to those stories and I understood why they were sharing those lessons with me. But even with all of that, um, I I remember the most significant moment of my law school career at Duke University. And it was second semester, my first year. And it was our first class on constitutional law. And it was the first time that we really discussed race in that court in law school. And for me, someone who had gone to law school because I wanted to be a civil rights attorney, I was inspired by, two of my heroes, Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston, and how they used the law as a vehicle for affecting social change. And that inspired me. I wanted to do something similar. And so I'm sitting in law school, I'm sitting in my con law class, and Walter Dellinger, who was my professor, I went on to become his research assistant. And also, he went on to become the Solicitor General for the United States under President Clinton. And he told a story about what the civil rights movement really turned on, like how the civil rights war was won. And he talked about how it was won because of the use of the Commerce Clause. And he told a story to start the class. He said, I want you to imagine what it's like to be a Black family living in the North in the 60s. And you're traveling south to see your family in Mississippi or your family in Louisiana or in Alabama. He said, you start out maybe Chicago, maybe Detroit. He said, and you begin to drive south. You can't stay in hotels, and you're not going to be able to freely stop and eat or use the bathrooms or any of those things. So you plot your course and your stops based on where you have friends and family where you can spend the night. He said you pack meals for you to eat in the car, and you drive south. As I listened to the story, I thought about my personal experience going to visit our family in Natchez, Mississippi, or in New Orleans, or in Waterproof. And I thought about how we never stopped. We never spent the night in hotels. I thought about how my mother would pack sandwiches. And I vividly remember the aluminum foil or the wax paper that those sandwiches were packed in and the snacks were packed in, and how we ate those as we drove, and how we told stories or sang songs, and how the experience felt very much like this wonderful camping trip. But I never understood the experience that those trips were built upon until I sat in that law school class. And I listened to Professor Dellinger talk about that the cases were won because of the utilization of the Commerce Clause, that it was an unreasonable restriction on interstate commerce. That was the legal argument that Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston made to prevail in court. And it brought me to the first point that I want to share with you. And that is the first inconvenient truth on this matter is justice never has been, nor will it ever be enough to ensure equity, inclusion, and the abolishment of racist practices. The civil rights movement, the civil rights legislation it didn't even prevail because it was the right thing to do. It prevailed because of our reliance on capitalism and the idea that you could not unreasonably restrict interstate commerce was why Jim Crow was able to be defeated. It wasn't that it was wrong to treat fellow countrymen and women in a substandard fashion. It wasn't even that it was wrong for terrorists to walk the South in broad daylight by means of the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan. It wasn't that we as a Christian-based society found it to be a violation of our ethics or our religious principles, because if we are honest, far too many people in the South got up from church on Sundays and lynched people on Sunday afternoons. These are our inconvenient truth. It was never about justice. It was never about justice. And so as we sit here and are faced with some other very uncomfortable realities about the resurgence of white nationalism, the resurgence, the comfort, the brazenness of people to march through the Capitol carrying the Confederate flag. There are people among us who think that is a violation of our core, of our ethics, of our sense of decency. And to them, I respond, yes, it is all those things. But it was never our ethical core. It was never our sense of decency, which allowed us to prevail in the fight against racism. We won the first time because of the economic reality. It was an economic argument that allowed us to win. And if we are honest, we will acknowledge that Dr. King, while he was threatened, while he was harassed, while he was terrorized for talking about voting rights and that sort of thing, it wasn't until his argument turned to an economic basis that we saw him be murdered. It was when he began talking about the Poor People's Campaign. It was when he went to Memphis and fought on behalf of the sanitation workers and the I Am a Man movement that he was murdered. And so the first inconvenient truth is absolutely that justice has never been enough, nor will it ever be enough for us to prevail. But that leads us to the second inconvenient truth. And that is, we don't care enough about this issue at this present moment for sustainable change to occur. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. A little over 4 years ago, this country elected a president that was blatantly racist. A president who dog whistled, then yelled that white supremacy had a place in his administration and in this country. He allowed people who had been pushed to the shadows to come out of those shadows. And I understand that there are people out there who take offense at me saying that, but that doesn't mean it isn't true. That doesn't mean that that's not the reality. When you call the white supremacists who marched on Charlottesville very fine people, you have sent a message. You have said, I'm with you. You have said to those of us who are threatened by those individuals that I'm not with you. I choose them over you. And the part that was particularly damaging and hurtful and deafening, quite frankly, was the silence of others, was the compromise that many people who walk among us right now made in the support of this administration, who, for whatever reason, felt that they could tolerate blatant racism, that they could tolerate the attempt to minimize the place in society of other Americans so that they could have something else that they wanted. Now, I understand politics. I am a man who has grown up his entire life surrounded by politics. But I also understand that this idea that we can somehow turn our back on each other and diminish others based upon their race, based upon their gender, based upon their religious beliefs, that we somehow think we can build the strongest nation possible while simultaneously doing that is a Faustian bargain. It's a lie, it's a fallacy. That's not the case. Because when you go there, you create a road that is extraordinarily difficult to come back from. And so now, when we look at what this acquiescence has wrought, when we look upon the fact that there was an attempt to overthrow a legitimate election, that people stormed the Capitol. And by the way, as someone who's interned in Congress, as someone who worked in the White House, someone who has traveled those halls, the idea that you could just storm one of the safest buildings I've ever been in is a little bit hard for me to accept that that took place without there being people who supposedly were against such behavior, without those individuals somehow assisting them. Right? It just seems it's beyond the pale to expect me to believe that that's the case. And so what we have to come to understand is we are now in a period where we have watched our cities erupt in turmoil because of police brutality. And that police brutality had its genesis, had its foundation in race. And the idea that Black men and women and children are somehow more threatening than anyone else. And the idea of policing, by the way, came out of slavery, right? And I'm not going to go all the way down that path, but I think it's important that we understand where these things came from. That this version of it, not all of it, but this version of it came from came as a byproduct of slavery. And so when we think about all of the atrocities that we have witnessed through the last, let's just talk about recent history, like the last 5 or 6 years. When I think about the fact that I watched Eric Garner die on YouTube, on the same laptop that I am speaking with you on today, I watched Eric Garner beg for his life, say that he could not breathe, watch crowds around him, watch this man die. When we think about that, when I think about the young girl, the young Black girl in McKinney several years ago that was manhandled by the police officer, when she wasn't a threat. There was nothing threatening. Like, I looked at her and she could have been my daughter in a few years. She could have been any of my students. She could have been my sister. But her real crime was the color of her skin. Then when we fast forward to this summer and Brother Floyd was murdered and begged for his life and pleaded in the same way that Eric Garner did. And the country erupted, but it erupted in part because we were in a place where people were paying attention because there was nowhere else for them to go. And we were forced to come to grips with who and what we have been. It proved to be too much for people. And so now we live in this era where we're beginning to see incremental change. But we can't be assured that this is going to be sustainable because there are root causes that have threatened our country and threatened our citizens and threatened our people. And I don't know if we're addressing those root issues, right? Like, you've got to deal with the decades of inequitable funding that is taking place in our schools, the hardships that families have felt. And, you know, I, as a president of an institution where 85% of our students are Pell Grant eligible, meaning they come from the lowest socioeconomic strata in this country, on a day-to-day basis, I watch how hard people work to carve out a life. These aren't people who are freeloaders. These aren't people who want handouts. These are people who just want an opportunity to build an economically secure life for themselves and their families. But you see, every year that those individuals can't make a living wage, every year that the institutions that educate their children are inadequately funded, that's another year that they fall behind. And then those years are compounded until people are so far behind that the investment it takes to address those issues is far more significant. And then somehow we make the political compromises that don't ever allow them to catch up. And then we expect these folks to succeed in an environment where success has never really been an option. And so if we are going to change that, if we are going to make a difference in their lives, we're going to have to care more. We're going to have to ask ourselves, what are we willing to do? What are we willing to compromise? What are we willing, people of privilege and comfort, what are we willing to give up to ensure that these changes actually take place? And when you start framing it in the language of sacrifice, or another way of saying the language of scarcity, then that's when people are really tested. Because I don't think it has to be a zero-sum game. I don't think that I have to have so much less so that someone else can have more. But I do recognize that sacrifices must be made. And so the question becomes, when will we care enough to make a difference? And in the entirety of civilized mankind, poverty has been an entrenched state because no one has ever cared enough to eradicate poverty. So when you add poverty to race, it becomes even that much more complex. So the first two inconvenient truths are, number one, that justice was never enough and it will never be enough to create sustainable change. There must always be something that accompanies it. For the civil rights movement, it was an economic argument. I would argue that it might always be an economic argument. Secondly, we as a society don't yet care enough about this issue to affect long-term permanent change. And we will know that we do when the language around the change becomes something that lends itself to permanence. Now, the third inconvenient truth about this uncomfortable topic is that when you look at the Civil War, it has become painfully obvious that the North won a battle that it thought was a war, but the South won the war. And the reason why I say the South won the war, because it turns out that the real war was a cultural war. The real war was a war for the soul of our nation. And when you think about the fact that the Confederate monuments weren't erected immediately after the Civil War, that Jim Crow, the war that took place around Reconstruction, when you look at these things, when you look at how the South was terrorized, when you look at the fight that we're fighting today, when you look at the fact that the Confederate flag, which was a sign of treason, was allowed to fly from state capitals in Mississippi and South Carolina until recently, right? Think about what it took. It took the murder of the brothers and sisters in the AME church in South Carolina for South Carolina to take down the Confederate flag off the grounds of the Capitol. It took this summer, and the prospect of athletes rebelling in Mississippi and students rebelling for the flag to come down, the Confederate flag to come down in Mississippi. Imagine a country where the people who lost the Civil War were allowed to preserve their history and the symbols of the protest, of the treasonous acts. So when you think about this, you cannot then be surprised by what we saw 2 weeks ago when the Capitol was stormed and the terrorists and the treasonous took the steps that they took. Because in this country, we have a history of treason being rewarded. Right? Think about many of our textbooks that our students are learning from and how they characterize slavery. It's viewed as the lost cause, that slavery was fought not over slavery, which it really was. I mean, the Civil War was fought over slavery. That's not what students were being taught. In some cases, slavery was being viewed as a work program, like some kind of student work study program gone horribly wrong. When you look at these things, when you think about the fact that there was always a compromise, even in our foundational documents for this country, there was always a compromise around the treatment of African Americans, always. And so then we can't really be shocked when we know our history to look forward and realize that some of these compromises have carried forward to this day, that we have as a country always been willing to sell out the interests of a significant part of our citizenry for our own personal gains. And I understand that's uncomfortable, which is why I call this, inconvenient truths about uncomfortable topics. But this is our reality. This is who we have been as a country. And so as we sit here now, we want to talk about anti-racist behavior. We want to talk about justice. We want to talk about diversity. We want to talk about inclusion. First and foremost, we need to talk about openly and honestly why we are in the place we are in. And I would argue the truth of the matter is, number one, we don't care. Or number two, we don't care enough. Number one, as long as we're framing this in a conversation around justice, that's never going to be enough. But then number three is we have to go back in and actually win the war this time. Not the battle, but the actual war. And that is heartbreaking. And I understand that it's heartbreaking, but it doesn't make it untrue. And it doesn't mean that if we're going to win, we're going to have the conversation. There's no way around that. You know, at Paul Quinn College, we have the luxury of having that conversation openly. And we tell our students, we're not preparing you for the sunny days. That's not what leadership is. Anyone can lead when the sun is out. The real test of leaders, the real test of leadership, the real test of whether or not you are made with the right stuff is, what do you do when it rains? What do you do in a storm? What do you do when the people you counted on don't hand you the umbrella? When they turn and run away? What do you do when it's hard? Because that's the test of leadership. We are building students to tackle the great issues of our time. We tell them we live to eradicate poverty, but we also live to eradicate racism. But we can't do that on our own. We can't just sit and say, you know what? I, as a Black man, I am determined to eradicate racism and I can do it by myself. No, it doesn't work that way. We're going to need allies. And I would argue we need more than allies. We need advocates. We need people who fight the fights for us, even when we aren't in the room. And many of you do that. There are many wonderful allies and advocates who help fight the battle against adversaries. But you need to understand this won't be won in a year. The Biden presidency didn't all of a sudden miraculously fix this. Kamala Harris being the vice president didn't miraculously fix this. Just like Barack Obama being president didn't miraculously fix this. The Obama presidency served as a reminder to those individuals among us how far they had fallen, and they fought back with a fervor that has been incredible. And we are seeing that. So as I begin to wrap up to take questions, what I want to make sure we understand is we have to commit to the South not winning anymore. That that the Confederacy will not prevail moving forward, that our children will not grow up fighting these same fights, that a democracy based on diverse peoples can win. That is the great American experiment, because there really isn't examples anywhere around the globe where a diverse population really has successfully crafted democracy. People haven't been fighting back against the notion that there should be representation. They're fighting back against the notion of who that representation includes. That has to change. So if we want a society that is just, that is inclusive, that welcomes each other, that lives up to its potential, if we want to stop having conversations about how we address anti-racist and how we build, institutions that reflect the best held values, then we're going to have to root out those among us who believe in something other than the principles that we articulate. We're going to have to root out those individuals who would rather us be bastions of racism and white nationalism instead of citadels of hope and inclusiveness. And we're going to have the language, we're going to have to frame the language in a way that people understand exactly what we're talking about. And so these inconvenient truths, it is my hope, it is my prayer that they will not always be truths, that we will push back, that the Confederacy will not be allowed to move forward as the winning vision, that there will be people who care enough to put it all on a line to stake change, that they will have conversations with their neighbors, with their coworkers, who when they embrace and make the intellectual compromises that allow them to support people who back practices and values that are offensive to the best among us, to inclusiveness, to our visions, that those individuals will be challenged and will be, that those individuals will understand what it's like to be threatened, to be harassed, to be called names, to be terrorized, to find no safe quarter in the community that they call their own, in the cities that they call their own, in chat rooms, in places where they should be safe to exchange their ideas. Because until those moments occur, this will always be the most uncomfortable truths that we have to acknowledge. I thank you for the opportunity to spend time with you this evening. Thank you, Dr. Nesbitt, for the invitation. And I welcome answering any questions for anyone that might have them.
Thank you, Dr. Sorrell, for your enlightening words. And at first, I want to apologize to you on behalf of UT Southwestern. Um, you know, there are no words to really speak to this event, except to say that this is why we exist. This is why we do what we do, and it's not easy by any far stretch. And every day we have to stay in it for the greater good, quite honestly. And so I have taken this step to shut down the chat room for that reason, because we need to have a safe space to continue the conversation. But I assure you that there are a large number of participants online, and I have a couple of questions from them from the Q&A, and a few people who have asked that they've not been able to log in, mainly because we had that particular difficulty.
Well, Dr. Nesbitt, let me say this before you go on. In no way, shape, or form is this your burden to carry. In no way, shape, or form is this UT Southwestern. Like, I know UT Southwestern, right? I love UT Southwestern. When we couldn't find anyone to support us in our students' needs, UT Southwestern stood up for us, and they stood up for students, and in a way that will forever be one of the defining moments of my presidency. So one insecure fool will never change how I feel about UT Southwestern, how my institution feels about UT Southwestern. This is the world we live in. But when I tell you that that has rolled off my back, like, it just sits back there with all the other experiences that I don't choose to give any more thought to. So no, this is not your burden to carry, and we are all good.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your words, and your candor in really explaining and discussing in a very clear manner the issues that we are dealing with, because I wholeheartedly agree with you, is that we're not fighting a battle of on a battlefield with guns and knives anymore, although we could be. We are really fighting a mentality and a cultural revolution, if you will, that we have got to overcome. And overcoming that is it's more than just having a few workshops and a few lectures. It really is getting into the hearts and minds of folks, of good people who really have good intentions and really want this place to be better. They want the world to be better, and they want UT Southwestern and the United States to really live in the spirit of the intent. Is going to require digging in and really testing our own fate, and testing our own grit to really carry that through. A couple questions I do have from a couple faculty. In medicine, we tend to speak about disparities and avoid discussion of the social structures, i.e. the root causes or fundamental causes that actually lead to the loss of Black lives. How can we advocate to change this narrative given our science-based medicine curricula and largely white senior faculty? What tips do you have for us?
That's the first time I've ever been asked that question. Um, I would tell you a couple things. The first thing is to step outside the classroom and create shared experiences that provide a unique entree into the conditions that are creating some of what you are finding. And let me be very clear, I'm not advocating becoming poverty tourists, right? What I am advocating is becoming informed citizens of the experience, right? I will tell you a very personal story. When I was offered this job as a President Paul Quinn, I called my sister to talk to her about it. And my sister is a public school teacher in Chicago, Illinois. She will tell you she's the educator in the family, right? And she is, you know, she and I, our educational paths in a sense, diverged early in high school. But she wound up attending an HBCU in Alabama, Talladega. And the student population in Talladega was very different than the student population at Oberlin or the student population at Duke. And so when I talked to her about taking the job, she said, listen, she said, Mike, you don't know these students. She said, you don't know what it's like to every day walk in the lives of people who come from poverty. And she said, you're not, she's like, you're not a jerk. She said, you contribute, you give money to the right causes. She's like, you give your time. She said, but then at the end of the day, you turn around, you go home. You go back to your really nice house and your really nice car with surrounded by people who are doing really, really well financially. She said, you don't have to sit and live in it. She said, you don't know the lives of the students that you are going to be responsible for. And you talk about it, an uncomfortable truth, like my younger sister drops that one on me. And she was absolutely right. The 14 years that I've been in this position have have given me, I've been able to bear witness to what it's like to walk these communities with my students and their families, to sit in their homes, to make their fights my fights. That informed knowledge has transformed my leadership model. It's transformed the way that I manage Paul Quinn. But that has only been possible because I got out from my desk, from my office, from our institution, and engaged differently. So, what I'm really encouraging is that if you really want to do that, engage differently.
I love that. That is that's good word, as they say. And it really honestly fits with what we're currently doing with our curriculum revision around this particular topic. The next question is from an attendee who says, I was recently talking to a friend of mine who has been so frustrated with the system, police brutality in particular, and she's declined to participate in voting, despite living in one of the least gerrymandered districts in the state. What can we do to re-enlist folks who desire change, but who've grown disenchanted with the status quo and feel powerless to really change it?
So, I might look at this a little bit different. I think disenchantment is a necessary stop on the journey to revolution, right? And really what we're talking about is we need people to become revolutionaries. And we think about revolutionaries as people who are wielding guns and knives and bats and all those things. And sometimes revolutionaries can just yield their mind. They can wield their pocketbooks. They can wield their circles of influence, right? And so, the first thing is you have to be unhappy with your environment. And then next up from unhappy is a little bit disenchanted. And then you have to become disgusted. And right about the time you get disgusted, then you start to become activated, right? And so I don't mind your disenchantment. I just need you to stay with it long enough to become disgusted
I love
and then to vote, right?
yeah.
And if you don't like the candidates, if you don't like the options, maybe you should be a candidate, right? Maybe your friends should be candidates. Maybe you should get up off the bench and get in the game. And so we all make choices. We all make decisions, right? I am really unhappy with a lot of things that I see in our community. And, my choices were, do you go run for office? Or maybe you lead an institution that can fight the fights in a collective and collaborative way without having to campaign all the time. Well, that was my logic. Little did I know I'm always campaigning because we're always fundraising, right? So I just traded one campaign location for another. But my point is stay with us with your disenchantment because you're not that close from disgust.
So I want to touch on your position as president of an HBCU, and you took on Paul Quinn at a time when it was really, really struggling to survive, and gave it life again. Um, and at a time when, you know, many people were turning their backs, and people of your caliber who have bright futures are not willing to give your time and efforts to a place like Paul Quinn, and yet you've done it. Um, and over the past several years, until most recently, HBCUs have gotten a tepid reception in a lot of ways, because people are, you know, disenchanted with whether or not they should exist anymore, thinking that they were a part of the post Civil War and Jim Crow, and now perhaps we're past that. Give us a little view of where you see HBCUs now as a part of the landscape of education, of higher education. I mean, now that we have a vice president from an HBCU, where do you see them in the landscape of education?
Sure. So, you know, it's interesting. HBCUs have been stalwarts for a long, long time. And yet they've been looked down upon for a long, long time. You know, I mean, far too many. And look, you know, I'm just going to get in, you know, our Kool-Aid a little bit, right? I mean, for lots of families of means, you know, they didn't send their children that were the academic high performers to HBCUs, right? They sent the ones that needed a little extra time and a little extra attention, and, you know, but would never have considered the schools for their other child.
Right.
And I get it. I get it. Because, you know, one of the byproducts of the civil rights movement, unintentionally, I might add, was this idea that, and it comes from, you know, I mean, listen, it broke my heart to make this connection because, like I said, you know, Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall are my heroes.
Mhm.
But the separate is an inherently unequal argument is based intellectually on an idea that that which is all black is substandard, right? Like that, like that's how you get there. So the price that one pays for moving the race forward is tearing down that which sustained us and built us. And look, I'm the only person in my family that didn't go to a historically black college, right? Like if you went to college in my family, you went to an HBCU. One of my first cousins, I the only two. Um, and you know, my family used to give me a lot of grief about that. You know, which at the family reunions I win now because I'm like, yeah, but I'm the only one that's an HBCU president, right? Like so, and I've been doing this a long time, so I win, right? Like, but let me tell you where we are now. I think when we look around society, we realize, oh, we need these schools. And we don't need them just to take care of those who can't go anywhere else. We need them just like we need the black church. Because you don't want to live in America where there's no black church.
Amen.
Okay? I mean, and you know, and I would tell you, you don't want to live in America where there are no black colleges. Okay. But we have done a better job of financially supporting our black churches than we have done supporting our black colleges. And so we are asked to do more with less. And then when we don't always live up to it, we are judged more harshly. Now, that being said, I cannot give a pass to substandard performance, right? Whatever it is you have, you made a conscious decision to be there. So then you have to find a way. You have to find a way to thrive. And what we have tried to do with Paul Quinn is at every turn revolutionize the idea of what thriving looks like. Like it was never about survival for us. I mean, like the only reason that I thought this was a great job to take was because I thought we could do something great, right? Just candidly, like I saw a path, I saw a route forward. Um, but I also understood that we had some healing to do. We had some healing to do for ourselves, but we had some healing to do with the relationships in our community. And we have worked hard to do that. And we still have more, because you know how it is. People are slow to forgive, right? And even slower to forget. And I don't need you to forget. I just need you to give us an opportunity to compete. But I'm proud to be an HBCU president. I am proud of what we accomplished, because, what a lot of people don't realize is if you ask people in higher education for the 5 most innovative schools in America, we're on that list, right? I mean, Paul Quinn College in the deep part of Southern Dallas, 10 minutes from downtown Dallas, in a community that most people don't visit, has consistently produced innovations that other schools can only dream. I mean, we created our own version of a higher education model with the urban work college model, right? I mean, like our partnerships are UT Southwestern, Penn, Yale, Oberlin, Middlebury, Babson, right? Like, I mean, you go through UPenn, I mean, the who's who. Like, people are always shocked when they look at the resumes of our staff. Like, no, like we're not your little stepbrother, right? Like we demand a seat at the table that is the same as everyone else has. Do not little brother us, right? We're not your little brother, right? And we'll just keep proving that.
Well, I am immensely proud, and my colleagues, Preston Wiles and others who have forged the relationship with Paul,
Wonderful people.
Jessica Moore, and I could name others who
Carol North, like all of them.
so just in love, honestly, with the opportunities to be a part of that partnership, speak nothing but the absolute best about the work that they've been able to do. And I am just so happy that we can be a part of the solution rather than the complaints that continue to ravage us all the time. We're approaching 6 o'clock, and I'm always trying to be respectful of time on everybody's part, both yours as well as our listeners. And I appreciate your taking out time to share your words with us, to be gracious, not only to resist and respond to bad behavior, in the midst of this, there you are, defending the stance that we all take, but I will say that we stand with you. And I think as we think about these topics that are tough, they are incredibly hard. And although we've come through a hard election, we're not done yet. We've got a lot more challenging days and a lot more days that we're going to disagree about a lot of things with even people we like and know. But we have to be committed to make this work, to make this democracy work, and to continue to flourish as a society together. I thank all of you for attending. There were several other questions that came in as you were beginning to chat, and we'll perhaps pass some of those on to you
I
via
would love it.
email.
Yeah.
But I look forward to continuing the partnership, and perhaps we can do this at another time at a later date as well. Thank you
I
all.
would love it. And thank you again. And let me just say this one thing very quickly. The work that Preston and Carol and Jessica have done, it has not yet found the national audience that it should. I remain committed to helping that take place because I really believe that people need to understand what extraordinary individuals they are and the work that they have done around mental health and poverty is just extraordinary. So we're just honored to be a part of the UT Southwestern family.
Thank you. All right. Good night.